So we continue our studies of economic growth and development, and we're going to be focusing on economic development, which we distinguished in our last session by saying economic growth includes the gross domestic, it focuses on the GDP, right, the gross domestic product, total value of goods and services produced by the country. What, of course, GDP does not tell us is, in any way, does it improve the life for all people in the country? It is possible for the country to have a great improvement in growth, but the wealth of that growth does not filter down to most of the population. An example of a country that actually has had both growth and development within living memory at a phenomenal rate is South Korea. South Korea has gone from a country which is subsistence, primary agriculture and poverty, people grow their own foods and market them, the traditional model, to what is today a highly sophisticated economy with outstanding levels of education, outstanding prospects, health services, and is a world on the world market, produces secondary and tertiary items which are highly competitive with world prices. So therefore, if you were in South Korea, you would, in the last 2 generations, you would experience a tremendous growth, not only in economic not just economic growth, but also in economic development. Now, what we're going to look at this time is we're going to look in economic development 1, right, at 2 issues. Firstly, we're going to be looking about measuring economic development, and then we're going to continue to look at about, well, why is it some countries are facing, what barriers are countries facing in being able to improve their economy? That we're going to look at now. And in our second item, which will be economic development 2, we'll be looking at various methods that countries by themselves and the world communities can use in trying to overcome the economic development barriers, which are actually quite complex. Now, when you actually try to explain these issues, I'm going to be explaining just their root causes and their nature, but this is all grounded in economics that we've previously done. For example, if countries can't produce at competitive prices, right, various goods and services, those various goods and services, right, will fall within, individually, microeconomics. How the country manages the national economy in order to improve economic developments, particularly with supply side policies, will link with macroeconomics. How the country might be able to market its products and decide under what terms it's able to market its products to other countries, or strengthen its own currency, which are typical issues that developing countries face. This will be within global economics. So all of the discussion that we're going to be having now about economic development assumes that we have all this knowledge on board, which we've actually documented in detail in the previous episodes. Well, let's look at measuring economic development first. Right, and there are really 2 ways that we want to have a look at, which are both what we call composite methods. They're composite indices. If an index is composite, that means that there's no single ideal way of measuring economic development. For example, let's say that we look at the average income, right? It could be that the income, that wealth is reasonably well spread distributed throughout the country, or it could mean that the wealth is in very few hands. Okay, we add the Gini index, but is wealth to show how well it is distributed? But it doesn't tell us the whole story, because there's some countries which may not be particularly wealthy, but people feel fairly happy living in there. There are other countries which are vice versa, that they may have high GDPs, right? But people would often say that they'd much rather live on another part of the globe. So we will consider these in turn. We're going to look at two composite indices. Composite meaning that we've got more than one thing that goes into the equation. And the first thing we're going to look at is the HDI, right, which is the Human Development Index according to its, shall we say, its up-to-date definition. The Human Development Index does as follows. It rates a country on a zero, on a rating from 0, which means the development is appalling, there's none, and no country scores that, to 1, which means it's outstanding, or ticks all the boxes. No place in the world's got 1. If it has a rating of above 0.8, countries like Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, for example, it's doing very well. If it's a country that's got below 0.5, right, it's doing very badly. Right? Some countries like Somalia can probably go down to below 0.2. It accepts the fact that there's no way that's absolutely bad, no country that's absolutely bad, and there's no country that's absolutely that's absolutely wonderful. Heaven and absolute heaven and absolute hell do not exist on this planet, and it recognises that. Now, what the Human Development Index does is it takes 3 indices into account. Right? The first index is the income, right, per person, which is actually adjusted for the PPI, the PPP, the purchasing power potential power, which means that in some countries the prices are very high, and in some countries the prices are much lower. So there's an adjustment, right? So it's the income, real incomes per person. The second thing that it's adjusted for is education levels, right? The second thing that goes into the equation, right? How universal is education at the primary, at the secondary, and at the post-high school, tertiary level, colleges of education, training, universities, and so on. And then the third thing is life expectancy at birth. And now, life expectancy, let's have a look and see what they measure. Right? Real income measures your access to financial resources, how much money you have. Education, right? Education is how many years and levels and so on. Is the second thing, because it shows how competitive the workforce is. It goes on the assumption that a better educated workforce, right, is likely to be more economically more productive. Right? And then finally, life expectancy at birth is a measure of health. Right? On average, how long do people live in the country? Right? Average for males and females. Right? And between them, what happens is that you end up with a figure. How you calculate the figure today is based on an extremely complex set of algorithms which are outside the scope of this course. Just bear in mind that when a country receives a rating of over 8, right, like for example Sweden, it's doing extremely well, and if it's a country that is under 5, that means it's in big trouble. Ending with something like Southern Sudan, which is considerably less than under 5. And in that way, if a country is actually doing better, say in 2023 than it was doing in 2022, right, then it means that overall its human development has improved, and otherwise, and vice versa. So those are the main points that actually go to human development. Income, levels of education, which is how economically powerful the workforce is, and the rate of health of the population. There is, the pluses of course are, right, let's have a look and see what, let's evaluate for a moment. The good things about it are that it takes into account the power of the workforce, which is seen to be a product of its education, right, and also the health of the workforce, which is also seen to be based on life expectancy at birth. That is the assumption. However, there are plenty of instances where this can be questioned. For example, is the education that a country gives provided free of charge by the country necessarily the skills that industry wants? For example, a university degree in an arts subject may not be ideal for a country which is trying to recruit people with scientific and mathematical skills, right, in order to develop and operate cutting-edge technology. Another example is life expectancy at birth. Right, you can question that by saying, well, just because a person's going to have a long life doesn't necessarily mean a person's going to be having an enjoyable life or even be able to enjoy a productive life. In other words, it goes away, it's an advanced industry because it does do one thing, it doesn't just rely on one statistic. It tries to average them out and balance them by a complex algorithm. But what it doesn't necessarily do is that it doesn't necessarily manage to plumb the individuality of the country, and it may have some other compensating factors, right, such as people feel safe politically, which would counterbalance the fact that they may, that the levels of education may not be so high. This is one way. Another way, right, is said that the standard of living of the country can be measured is by the GII, which is the Gender Inequality Index. Now, this is something that's been developed more recently, and is based on the assumption that the difference between a country that has got high levels of development and low levels of development is mirrored by the level of the difference between men's prospects and women's prospects within a particular country, right? So that it looks at three different things, right? The first thing that it looks at is empowerment of women. I will explain that in a moment. Right? The second thing that it looks at is reproductive health. Right? And the third thing that it looks at is the difference of the economic situation of women. Now, I'll bring them all together. The economic situation of women is it compares what women and what men to what degree women are actually included in the job market, and whether they're actually getting similar salaries, for example, they've got similar prospects for being able to do the same work. Do women have the same ease of access to education and to training that men have? The second thing that it does is it looks at women's reproductive health. Now, this comes in particular forms. One of the things is how many women under a certain age have already got children. This isn't necessarily a good thing. What it actually catches out are countries where children, where females find themselves persuaded or worse into having children before they've actually managed to complete their education. That's one of the things that go through. Now, this of course doesn't happen to men. Men in none of those countries seem to be in a hurry that men should reproduce, but they do for women. And often it's this type of thing often women who are forced to reproduce sort of very soon after puberty or during puberty, because they can suffer very serious barriers health-wise, right, because of the experiences that they've actually gone through. Right, so there's they investigate that. And finally, the empowerment of women. What percentage of women are in the government? That's one example. Right? That's the degree of So in other words, what they do is that in working out the GII, the Gender Inequality Index, they look at different indices, right? The empowerment of women, the economic situation of women, and the reproduction health of women, right? And they actually compare that with the situation as far as possible with men. And the less the gap between them, the better the situation is of the national economy. And what they do is that each country, right, again, it's a complex algorithm outside the scope of this course at either standard level or higher level. And if the algorithm is above, if the Human Development Index is above 0.8, then it means it's a good place for women to be if women want to be part of the workforce, right? And they want to have independence. But if it's below 0.5, that means that it's a country where there is a very serious, which is being held back by very serious differences between the role of men and the role of women, given the fact that women potentially form 50% of the workforce. So that explains, common to both of these, is that they are composite indices in that whether we use the Gender Inequality Index or the Human Development Index, in both cases, right, we are dealing with several elements, indices, not one. And the Gender Inequality Index does actually focus on that particular issue, which may be missed by the Human Development Index. However, one thing that should be borne in mind is that by and large, countries that score high on the HDI, such as Sweden, the Netherlands, Finland and Switzerland, also score very high on the Gender Inequality Index, right? Which means that there's usually very little inequality between the prospects of males and the prospects of females. Now that completes economic development number one, which the first part, which is measuring economic development. We will now move forward and we're going to say, well, it's all very nice if you can measure high economic development. Lots of countries would like to improve their economic development. What's holding them back? That's what we're going to spend the next few minutes looking at. So we're going to put the heading, Barriers to Economic Development. We're going to list them. We're going to just list a sample, right? There are many. But these are ones that are commonly suffered by the countries which are, firstly, Africa south of the Sahara, B, Central Asia and much of Southeast Asia, including India, and C, some of the countries in South America that are having more difficulties. And the problem number one is reliance on primary products. If the country is exporting primary products, and that's what it's based, for example, it's importing wheat, it's exporting wheat, it's exporting coffee, right? It's exporting rubber, right? Or even if it's exporting oil, it is a country at great risk for the following reason. The primary products by nature tend to be price inelastic in demand. We've come across this idea. So that, let's say that we'll pick a primary product, cacao. That's what you make cocoa out of, right? So if the price of the primary product, and we say that it is cacao, right, and this is the curve for it, that's the demand. Now, let's say that the world supply, right, is at, the world price, let's say, is at P1, and the quantity supplied by the world is Q1. So that means that, let's say, the farmer might get $2 per kilo of cacao. Then what happens is that new countries enter the market to produce cacao as well, which means that the quantity goes from Q1 to Q2. That will mean that there is a huge wallop down in the prices, and that meant that at P2 you might only get 50 cents, right? You may only get 50 cents. Well, the cacao farmer says this isn't fair, because my cacao is just as good as it was last year. Why don't I get my usual $2? And he says, sorry, the number of people that actually produce cacao has increased, but people aren't suddenly eating twice as much chocolate. So for that reason, as a general, any country that relies on primary products, as they tend to increase worldwide faster than the world's population, is likely to suffer a fall in prices. It's much better that countries specialise in tertiary products and in secondary products, because if the country like Japan, right? Japan specialises in producing different types of computer technology. Even if their technology changes, because it's all set up, they can adapt from one particular product to another type of product, because these products are elastic, price elastic in supply. Whereas somebody who produces cacao cannot adapt, because everything's so inelastic in supply. You can't produce cacao one year and coconuts the next. He's stuck. So therefore, a country that over-relies on primary products is a sitting duck to be able to suffer problems in development, and that is one of the key reasons why the poor countries, which rely on these products, are getting poorer and poorer, and the rich countries are getting richer and richer by benefiting from all those cheaper prices. So that is one key reason why economic development is one main barrier. The other thing is low investment. Now, for low investment, I would like to refer you to the cycle of poverty that we looked at in the last unit. When we're talking about the cycle of poverty, remember that we said that countries where people can't afford to save, they're not going to have money to be able to improve new technologies or to be able to open new businesses, because there simply aren't the funds to be able to borrow. Now, to make things worse, richer countries, unless there's some very, very good reasons, aren't particularly happy to invest in countries where they've got low levels of savings. A third reason, we're going to look at some more reasons next time, because we're going to bridge that way. We're just going to look at two more reasons. Right? The third reason is infrastructure. Now, in order for countries to be able to be competitive, you have to be able to move things around cheaply. You've got to have roads, you've got to have railways, you've got to have good ports and things like that, so that goods and services can be cheaply exported. You've got to have broadband internet. People have got to be able to have access to the internet. If any of that isn't working, then, or it is unreliable, then it means that countries are being held back to development simply because they haven't got the system to be able to connect it all together. A classic example is northern Nigeria. Right? Nigeria is a very large country, but there's very little development of rich mineral resources in northern Nigeria because there isn't a satisfactory road and railway system to be able to distribute its products, to be able to bring it to the ports for export. We're going to look at one more today before we actually bring it, which is, the fourth one is debts. Now, if countries are in debt, that means there is a lot of capital flight. capital flight means that a large amount of money leaves the country because the country has been borrowing from richer countries. And a classic example is Liberia in West Africa. Now, Liberia has got enormous debts, and what's been happening is that a lot of the materials that are produced by Liberia are used in settlement of debts to other countries. So that means that there's very little, very little for investment. Now, there are some other factors that we're going to look at, and I'm going to use that to be able to open our next and final session, which will be on economic development, and that will be economic development 2. So thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. Please view the second one to be able to, so that you can get the whole picture together. Thank you.